Also in Warrington tonight, David Conn, who writes for The Guardian. He's written extensively about Hillsborough over many years, and I just wonder what today has been like.
Well, following your excellent report just then, Jimmy McGovern is obviously somebody who is very central to the overturning of the false narrative by the South Yorkshire Police, which was embedded until Jimmy McGovern's landmark drama documentary in 1996, which exposed the ongoing injustice, which we don't have to say alleged injustice, whereby police who have now been found to have unlawfully killed 96 people, and where no misbehaviour by supporters has been found to have contributed to the disaster at all. At that time, the police had not acknowledged any fault at all and had relentlessly come up with these allegations of misbehaviour. But I had the same conversation with Jimmy McGovern way back then, 20 years ago, and he made this point to me, which has really hit home to me over the years, which is this story that actually the Hillsborough families, what they are demonstrating and illustrating is the absolute power, which has turned out to be the indomitable power of love. And those people have been vilified, their loved ones were vilified, the football supporters were vilified, the people of Liverpool were abused and called lachrymose instead of having feeling. And these families have done it because they lost their loved ones, they lost their children. There were 58 people who lost a parent, and this is 27 years. There are some children that weren't even born because there were 3 partners of people who died who were pregnant, and all they've ever known is the fight for justice at Hillsborough. And I've come to know them from coming to the inquest. They're now obviously in their late 20s and 30s, some of these people who were children when their father died. There was also a mother of 2 teenage children, and one of them, Becky Shah, she's been here many, many days of the inquest. There is a sense of, there isn't triumph, I wouldn't say. That there's a feeling of vindication. That's what there is today, Eddie. There's a feeling of vindication here.
You mentioned the false narrative, and I saw you ask a question at the news conference given by some of the families and others today, which I asked them how did the false narrative not only get going, but how was it maintained over so many years? What do you think the answer to that is?
I think the answer is that the police got their false narrative out immediately. And we know that Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield lied about the genesis of the disaster. And instead of right then when people were dying at 3:15 p.m. on the afternoon, he said, as is now notorious, that Liverpool supporters had forced a gate open instead of admitting that he had actually ordered it to be opened. And that false narrative was maintained and solidified throughout the afternoon and evening, even as people were dying, even as families were having to come to terms with utter devastation of they waved their people off to a football match and then they turned up in the early hours of the morning to Hillsborough, to the horrible gymnasium, to have to identify them in a body bag. And to me, what's been extraordinary, as I asked in that press conference, is that when you have been sitting through the inquest day after day, all of this was on film because the BBC was covering the match in colour for the football, for the actual football. John Mopson, who's still commentating on Match of the Day, was commentating on the match. So all of this was actually captured in full Technicolor, and you can see no misbehaviour, and you can see supporters heroically helping in the crisis rather than doing the disgraceful lies that the police accused them of. So to me, Eddie, it's actually an extraordinary question for the media, is how was a false narrative able to be so well established that it took 27 years to overturn? And as you've said, that they came here again, some of the police barristers, and tried to throw the same stories again. So it's still stubbornly sticking, when in fact, the evidence was right there in front of people's eyes. And I think we've seen this in other situations where not just the police, but other powerful organisations, that they grab the media story, they grab the perception on the day when it's big news, and then it becomes very, very difficult to shift. And even after today, I think you've just had Bernard Ingham, haven't you, saying that he still doesn't apologise. He still doesn't reverse the perception that he had, that he was given by the police the day after. And there will still be people around the country, even despite this 2-year inquest and multi-millions of pounds that it's cost, complete vindication, who think they sort of know that it wasn't quite like that and there must have been some misbehaviour. And I think that is because the narrative was grabbed and owned right at the beginning by people who were painting a false narrative.
Do you think it would have been different if it wasn't Liverpool?
I do think that the fact that it was Liverpool had an impact on the ease with which it was they were able to paint the false narrative. Yes, and I think that part of what this dreadful injustice, which has devastated people's lives after they already had the devastation of grief, part of this injustice is about caricaturing of groups, caricaturing of people, stereotyping of people. So what we had was football supporters who are now accepted to be just about everyone, and it's water cooler talk, and it is our national game and just about everybody celebrates it. Football supporters vilified because of the misbehaviour of a few, of a minority. And we had Liverpool as a city somehow vilified for, I don't know exactly what the roots of that are, through some comedy sketches or whatever, as scallies. And I do think that those caricatures did make the false narrative more stubborn. Although I think that the most powerful narrative was against football supporters, and I think that it would have been applied to them, whichever club it was. And I think that there's a wider lesson here, because we see it now with other groups being caricatured as some kind of other, some kind of criminal group, some kind of group that are they're not quite us. And whenever you actually meet people from whatever group, you tend to find, as you do with the Hillsborough families, that they are really good, really nice, really decent people who love their families. And that is Jimmy McGovern's lesson again. The enduring power of love is, the dominant story of Hillsborough.
Just finally, from your contact with them, how much were they prepared for a verdict that went, for a conclusion that went the other way, the way they didn't want?
That's a fair question. People were extremely worried about the verdict, not necessarily on unlawful killing, because they'd always been advised by their lawyers that it's a high bar for a jury. What they've found there is that there was a criminal level of negligence, basically by Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, and they were always told that that was going to be a high bar, and in the end that was a majority decision of 7-2. But the question that has been worrying people to extremities, and not just the families but also survivors, people who went to the match and ended up in the hell of those pens, the idea that question 7, supporter misbehaviour, would be identified as a contributing factor after 27 years.
I think I should say that whether any individual is guilty of criminal wrongdoing will be for authorities to decide in due course. Eddie.
Sorry. The reason I said that is because the coroner directed the jury that if they were going to come to a verdict of unlawful killing, they would have to find that the 96 were killed due to gross negligence manslaughter, and in the legal direction, that was all related to Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield and his actions on the day.
You'll understand.
So I do say that advisedly.
Of course. You'll understand my anxiety to be fair to everyone.
Yeah, I understand, of course.
I do want to ask you about what the next stage of this is, finally. Truth, justice, and then?
Well, they've been asked that question, haven't they? And they've said that they want accountability. There are 2 criminal investigations ongoing. One is into alleged possible manslaughter or other criminal offences which led to the deaths. And the other, as the Independent Police Complaints Commission has said explicitly, is looking at possible offences of perjury, perverting the course of justice, misconduct in a public office by police officers, by South Yorkshire police officers. And that is the seriousness of what potentially has happened here. And the families they're saying that they're not being vengeful, but that's our society. There's had to be the truth and accountability for 96 people going to a football match and dying under the care of a police force and an ambulance service. And there does have to be accountability of individuals for that, so that lessons can be learned.
David Conn from The Guardian, thank you.